All right, let's get right into it. We've got our hands on something pretty incredible, a recording that just surfaced from 1990. Now, this isn't some formal state broadcast or a big political rally. No, this is Saddam Hussein and his inner circle, the guys who were the original architects of the 1968 revolution. Just reminiscing. And the stories they tell are absolutely not what you'd expect.
So, you got to picture the scene. It's 1990. It's been over 20 years since they took power in the 17 July Revolution. These men, who risked absolutely everything, are now the establishment, and they're gathered together, sharing old stories from the front lines. But, what kind of stories do old revolutionaries even tell?
This one line, it just perfectly sums up the vibe of this entire meeting. It wasn't some serious, solemn reflection on all their grand achievements. It was something way more human and, honestly, a lot more bizarre.
So the source material we're digging into here is this really candid private recording. You should think of it less like a formal cabinet meeting and more like a campfire conversation, It's where the lines between what really happened, what they remember, and the myths they're building all start to get a little blurry. It's a really rare peek behind the curtain.
This is really the big question we're going to explore. Do they talk about their grand ideology, their brilliant strategy, epic, heroic battles? Well, the answer these tapes give us is a lot more surprising. It actually starts with chaos, total confusion, and a whole series of almost comical blunders.
Yeah, their first instinct isn't to talk about how brilliant they were. Instead, they just jump right into all the mishaps and screw-ups that happened back in the early days. That's right. The first thing that comes to mind, 22 years later, is this completely disastrous trip they took. It's a story full of misunderstandings, getting detained, and even some mid-air panic.
So it all kicks off at their very first stop in Algeria. One of their comrades is trying to explain that, Algeria is now free from French colonialism. But the Algerian officer he's talking to, his Arabic is a little shaky. All he hears is Algeria and colonialism in the same sentence, and he immediately thinks they're insulting his country. And just like that, the entire delegation gets put under arrest until 4 o'clock in the morning.
This really sets the tone for the whole thing, doesn't it? Because right after that airport mess, the story immediately goes to what happened next, after they were finally allowed to take off. The chaos, it turns out, was really just getting started.
So once they're finally in the air, one of the guys suddenly realizes he still has his friend's Mercedes keys in his pocket. He bolts to the cockpit, demanding the pilot turn the plane around. Then another one of them looks out the window, sees their own plane's engine, and starts yelling, "Israeli fighter jet!" The pilot, not taking any chances, immediately dives the plane 1,000 feet. It is pure comedy, and here they are, decades later, just laughing their heads off about it.
But the stories weren't all just slapstick and chaos. Tucked away inside all the laughter, there are these incredibly personal moments, anecdotes that really show you the very real human stakes of what they were all doing. One of the most telling stories is about a revolutionary, a man named Amr. It's the night before the coup, a moment where he could be killed at any time. And he sits down to write his last will and testament. But what's on his mind? It's not at all what you'd think.
I mean, you'd expect the revolutionary's last will to be packed with these grand political statements, right? Calls to arms, big ideals. But Amr's will? It was about settling this tiny little debt of 1.5 dinar. It was about making sure his family got their 150 dinar deposit back on a piece of land. And it was about apologizing to them for all the trouble he'd caused. And that was the group's reaction. They just found it hilarious. But it's also so incredibly humanizing, isn't it? In this moment of huge historical importance, what actually mattered to Amir were these small, personal things. It completely grounds their massive revolution in something deeply, deeply relatable.
And this is where the meeting really takes a turn. It feels very deliberate. After all the laughter, all the personal stories, the whole conversation pivots. It shifts away from remembering the chaotic past and towards framing a very specific vision for the future, a vision centered entirely on their leader. So you have to ask, why share all these stories of comical failures? I mean, it wasn't just for a good laugh. These anecdotes, they serve to humanize the revolutionaries. They make them seem like regular, even clumsy guys. But what that does is it sets the stage for a big contrast with their leader, who comes off as the calm, strategic center of everything. So one of the men, Ghassan, he steers the conversation. He brings up a talk he had with Saddam way back in 1976. And this is the real turning point of the entire meeting. All those chaotic memories from '68 are now being directly connected to this moment of supposed strategic genius from 1976.
This timeline here shows you exactly how they're building that narrative. You have the revolution in '68, then this key conversation in '76, and now, here in 1990, they're deliberately connecting all those dots. They are actively crafting a story of consistent, long-term thinking that stretches back for decades.
And this is the core message they wanted to lock in. According to the story they're telling, way back in '76, long before all the sanctions and wars of the 1990s, Saddam had already figured out that food independence was the ultimate defense against foreign influence, against what he called colonialism.
So the argument they're building is this. Food isn't just about farming. It's a weapon. It's a tool in international politics. And real, true independence, they argue, only comes from being able to feed your own people. And the story they're telling is that Saddam saw this with perfect clarity, almost 15 years before it became a crisis.
So what does this all add up to? What we're seeing is that this gathering was about way more than just taking a trip down memory lane. It was about actively shaping that memory. And that's really the key takeaway here. They weren't just recalling what happened, they were selecting what happened. They were weaving together these stories of chaos and foresight to create a kind of official history, a shared myth that served a very real purpose for them, right there in 1990. So the final story they built that day has these three clear parts. First, the revolutionaries themselves were just like us, flawed, relatable, prone to error. Second, their leader, Saddam, was different. He was the one with the unique, long-term vision. And so third, the revolution itself was this perfect mix of a very human struggle and a product of pure genius.
And in the end, every single story, from mistaking a plane engine for a fighter jet, to worrying about a 1.5 dinar debt, to this prophetic conversation about food security, all of it, every piece was folded neatly into a single coherent legacy. It was the story they needed to tell themselves and each other at that very specific moment in their history.
And that's really the question this recording leaves us with, isn't it? It's such a rare glimpse into how myths get made, not centuries later, but in real time. Because when the people who make history get together to tell its story, it's the parts they choose to remember, and maybe more importantly, the parts they choose to forget that really tell us everything.